Welcome to the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'm your host, Gary Durbin. I've been a worship leader for over 20 years, and I've learned a lot from so many on this journey. On this podcast, we'll have conversations and explore the dynamics of leading worship in the local church. How's your heart? Do you lead with adoration for God and people, or do you lead with ambition for yourself? That's a tough and pointed question, and it's one I've had to ask myself occasionally over the years. On this episode, I talked to Todd Stanley about having a pastor's heart, even as a worship leader. Todd began leading worship at the age of 15, and he has served in full-time ministry for over 28 years. The majority of those years were spent as a worship pastor, and leading worship continues to be part of his ministry. He currently serves as the Discipleship Pastor at Summit Church in Indiana, Pennsylvania. I'm excited for you to hear Todd's experience and heart. He's been serving faithfully for many years and has some great insight, wisdom, and perspective about ministry. So here's my conversation with Todd Stanley. Hey, Todd, welcome to the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'm so grateful to have you on this episode.
Hey, Gary, thanks, man. It's good to be here.
So we met in Nashville several years ago at a songwriters retreat conference. Yeah. And the thing I remember about you, I think the first time I remember you was it was like after hours, and we were I want to say at Michael Farron's office or something like that.
Okay.
And I was with someone else. Me and this guy were writing together.
Yeah.
And you were with someone else writing in another room. And I just remember your voice. Like you got a booming voice, man.
Yeah. Soft is not a word I would use to describe my voice, probably. I remember as a kid, even my dad said, never knew how to whisper. So.
So where are you from originally? Because I got a thought about where you're at right now, but where are you from originally?
I grew up in Arkansas, in the very southwest corner of the state in Texarkana, which is right on the border of Arkansas and Texas. Right. You referenced Michael Farron. He and I actually grew up together. We played Little League baseball together, but he lived on the Texas side of Texarkana, and I lived on the Arkansas side.
Nice. Yeah, right now you're living in Indiana, Pennsylvania.
Right, which is not confusing at all, right?
No. I actually Googled to see if there's a Pennsylvania, Indiana. And I think, because I thought that would be great, but it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Just Indiana, Pennsylvania. You're not that far from me, so that's really cool.
Yeah, just a couple hours. But in Pennsylvania, there are all of these cities that are named after other states. There's an Oklahoma, Pennsylvania. There's a California, Pennsylvania. It's really weird.
That's wild. They must have just ran out of names for cities.
I guess so. They weren't all that creative around here, I suppose, when it came to naming cities.
After the retreat, we kept a connection, and in the midst of that time, I was writing my book, More Than a Worship Leader, which is what this podcast is based off of. And I remember reaching out to you, and you were gracious to be a beta reader, and you checked it out, and then you eventually endorsed it. So on the back of my book, you see the endorsement from Todd Stanley.
Yeah, but I'm sure that sold you 2 or 3 copies.
Oh yeah, man.
But no, man, I was really glad to do that. And it's been a great tool. I've shared it with my teams. I've recommended it to other worship pastors. Thank you for putting in the time and sharing your heart and your gift with us. It's been a gift.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it, man. So right now you're an associate pastor at your church, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But you were a worship leader before that for many years. So one of the questions I ask everybody that comes on this podcast is, what is like an embarrassing or funny moment you could share that happened to you on stage?
All right. So when I was younger, like a lot of other kids, I had braces, but I had 2 of my teeth that that never came in. And so when I had braces, they created space for me to get implants, right? For me to get, those teeth in their right spots. But for a while, I had to wear this kind of like this little flipper thing that I would take out. It was kind of like my retainer, but it had teeth on it. And so over time, that thing got a little kind of loose. I grew up in a Pentecostal background, so things got, there was a lot of, demonstrative kind of worship, and I was leading worship at a youth retreat, and I was talking in between songs, and I was pretty excited. There was a lot going on. The Spirit of God was moving, and I tend to be pretty animated when I speak, and I'm really exhorting these young people to go after God. And my teeth flew out of my mouth, and somehow I caught them at about arm's length in front of my face and shoved them back into my mouth and just kept going. But I don't know of anyone else. I've never met another worship leader who has spat out their teeth while they were leading worship, but I did. And the room kind of stopped. There was all this stuff that was going on, but the room kind of stopped, and it was kind of like, did we just see what I think we just saw?
So they actually saw it happen, and you knew they saw it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Did the music stop, or did you guys keep going?
No, the band kept playing, to their credit. But but it was hard to get the room back.
So you've been in ministry for quite a while. Can you just share your journey to ministry and through ministry, and what you've been doing all these years?
Oh gosh. Ministry is all I ever said I wanted to do. My mom kept scrapbooks when I was in school. And so at the end of my kindergarten year in school, when it said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I had put the same thing that my dad did. My dad was, he worked for Cooper Tire, for the tire, the Cooper Tire company. So I put that I wanted to work for Cooper Tire like my dad did. But by the end of my first grade year, it said preacher. And so ministry is all I ever wanted to do. I'd like that never changed from the time that I was very, very young. I just knew that this is what I was called and created to do. And so started leading worship when I was about 15. Started leading worship in my youth group, and then as part of the worship team at my church growing up. And so out of college, went straight into full-time ministry. So I've been, involved in full-time ministry. I say full-time. I have been bivocational at times, but for all intents and purposes, full-time ministry, right? Since my early 20s, and I will be 49 this June. So been doing this for a while now. And any of you guys who are in ministry know it's not always easy, but man, this has been the best possible journey for me. I would not trade it for anything.
So how many years have you been in ministry total?
Let's see, I took my first staff position when I was 22. So 26 years.
26 years. And most of those years, your title was in the worship arts or worship leader, worship pastor realm, right?
Yeah. So my first staff position was as a youth pastor, but I was leading worship as well. It was one of those kind of dual role kind of things. Mm-hmm. So from my earliest days in ministry, I've been leading worship, but my official title at that point was youth pastor. And then there was a 3-year period where I was the lead pastor of a church plant. But outside of those two things, and I was a youth pastor for 3 years and a lead pastor for about 3 years. So for 21 of those, what would that be? Would that be right? Yeah, 20 of those 25, 26 years, my title was worship pastor. And so I've done that for obviously for the bulk of my ministry career, and have gone through a lot of the changes, man. Was wearing a suit
Mm-hmm.
every service when I started, had to
Mm-hmm.
direct a choir,
Yep.
all of that kind of stuff, all the way to, where we're at now.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I led choirs, wore the suit. I used to tell people I would be directing a choir with a special number, and then I'd have to turn around, put my guitar on, and lead worship.
You know it.
So
You know it.
so I don't miss those days, but they taught me a lot of valuable things, and I guess in a way I'm pretty well rounded because of all that. So I'm thankful for those days for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there are things that I learned during those times is, that I've been able to utilize over the years. When you're directing a choir, you definitely have to pay attention to harmonies and blending and all that kind of stuff, and those tools don't go away just because the group of vocalists is smaller. In fact, in some ways it's even more important when it's a smaller group, and so those have been valuable tools.
Yeah. So when you were younger, you said your occupation dream changed to preacher.
Yeah.
What made you change that?
I have to say it was the Lord. Even at that young of an age, I mean, I was 6 years old, but, like, I just there was just something in me that knew, it's like, I mean, how does anyone explain that they were called into ministry? I don't know that we have an explanation for that other than we heard the voice of God, and I don't know that there's an age limit on that, and so even as a kid, I feel like that God just captured my heart, and that I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to uh, tell people about Jesus, and I wanted to help people grow. I don't know that I would have articulated it that way at that young of an age, but that's really what that was all about.
Yeah, sounds definitely like a pastor's heart.
We talked about the fact that for the bulk of my ministry, worship pastor or worship leader has been my title, but that's really not ever what I set out to do. I wanted to be a pastor. I wanted you know, to see people grow and help disciple people. Uh, but what I decided early on was that whatever gifts that I had that I could utilize in that regard, that I could utilize toward that end, that I would do that. And whatever doors the Lord opened, that I would be, willing to walk through those. And I think sometimes we can confuse role with calling. And so, I just made up my mind that, look, my calling is to pastor, and whatever role that my giftings allow me to fill, I will fill that role and I will serve. And, I was fairly gifted as a singer and a musician. And so those were kind of doors that opened. And so I just continued to step into those places and into those, opportunities. And man, it was incredible. And God's been really faithful. Um, but I'll be honest when I say that, like, for me, it wasn't that I set out to be a musician or worship leader. I set out to be a pastor, and leading worship was a means to pastoring, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It reminds me of something that I tell my worship teams, which is the idea of serving. We're all called to serve. God has called us all to serve for his kingdom. It just so happens when I'm talking to the team, I said it just so happens that we're serving with our musical gifts.
Right.
Some of us are singers and musicians and tech people, and it doesn't make us any more special than anyone else. It
Yeah.
just means this is the way God's gifted us, and we're going to serve God with these gifts.
Right. And so, it's one of those things where, and I haven't always gotten it right. I mean, I'm like anyone else. Sometimes I can enjoy the spotlight and the attention more than I should, but I have always made my aim and my desire to be that whatever uh whatever role I was asked to fill, whatever that might be, whether it's on the stage, whether it's off the stage, whether it's, you know, I mean, if it's cleaning the toilets, whatever it might, whatever it might be, if I can serve people and if I can honor the Lord, then I want to be willing to do that. And so, man, I always caution whether it's musicians on my team or young worship leaders or pastors that I get the opportunity to mentor and pour into, like, um, if we put stipulations on things, if they if there's ever a point at which I say, well, Lord, if I can't do that, then I don't want to do anything. Man, I think that's a really dangerous place to be, and we have to check our hearts in that. And so it's always been my aim to just say, God, whatever I am able to do and whatever doors you open, that's what I'll step through those. I want to be faithful to go wherever you call me.
Yeah, I love that, man. Love that heart. You and I come from similar eras when we entered ministry. The landscape was a lot different than it is right now as we entered churches and we're serving and we're leading worship.
Yes.
So compared to back then to now, what do you see? You mentioned the idea of conditional serving a little bit, like I want things to be this way and that way. Now that the worship boom has really happened and it's a big thing,
Yeah.
what do you see are some of the dangers right now, with that worship leaders have that can make them get into that conditional mode?
Um, Honestly, it's really some of the same pitfalls that uh, anybody with a public platform can fall into. I don't know that the pitfalls are unique to worship leaders. Uh, I think the the cultural landscape that we find ourselves in is such that um, there's a real premium or value, an inordinate value really placed on celebrity or on building a platform, on likes and views and all of those kinds of things. And whether you're a worship pastor or a teaching pastor or whether you're not even in ministry at all, honestly, the danger for us is to place our sense of identity and value in those things and pursue those things and think that if I can build this platform, then somehow either A, it's going to validate me, which is a really dangerous thing, or two, it's going to validate my ministry, or somehow that, neither one of those is true. And neither one of those will fill the deep longings of our soul and of our heart. Um, and that's always been true, right? I mean, even before the days of social media, uh, if there's a danger always as a worship leader for us to draw our sense of worth and value from whether or not the people that we're playing in front of, whether or not they think we can sing well, or whether or not they like our music, or whether or not, we can tend to draw our sense of identity and value from that, rather than leaning into who we are as sons and daughters of God, and then and then our ministry suffers as a result of that. We guys, guys or girls, whatever, fall into um, moral failure or burnout or, any number of things because we're trying to fill a hole that only Jesus can fill.
You mentioned the public platform. That wasn't even a term I thought about when I got into ministry.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a thing, I don't think. Especially for worship leaders, it wasn't even I wouldn't say it was a big thing. But yeah, with the emergence of social media and the internet and all the things that have happened and having that platform, yeah, it's become a danger. I really believe that. And I think when I think about what's happened to worship leaders now, there's definitely a pressure to be cool. There's definitely a pressure to model what people see on YouTube or whatever it may be. And if you get there, or if you find your worth or your identity, like you talked about, I think you almost can be in danger of feeling like you deserve to be there too.
Yeah. So I remember as a young man, I toured and I say toured regional stuff, right? Not, but I traveled with a band, right? And we did youth conventions and we did summer camps and that kind of thing. And well, I remember standing at our merch table, right, at the end of a night one night, and there were a line of kids, and they want you to sign your autograph, which is just the weirdest thing. I was feeling a little too good about myself, to be honest. And I remember as I was standing there, and I'm signing all this stuff, I heard, I heard the voice of the Lord whisper in my ear and say, "That belongs to me."
Hmm.
And I knew immediately that what the Lord was saying to me was that I was I was taking glory that did not belong to me. That I was, whether those kids were intending for glory to terminate on me or not, I was allowing that to happen. I was willing for that to happen. And man, I mean, there's just like this sense of conviction just was like, oh, it's like, oh Lord, you know, but I like, and that's on a super small scale, right? But the point that I'm making is that is a real danger, and especially when in the environment that we have now, where this instant gratification with the likes and all of those kinds of things, where and I don't know if you've looked, how much of reading you've done on this stuff, but like literally the dopamine cycle in your brain and all of that kind of stuff that and so it legitimately can be a drug for people. And then that's a dangerous place to be as a worship leader, because then we start feeding off of that thing rather than feeding on Jesus, and on his presence and on his word and the things that really will nourish our soul.
That's good. Yeah, it can possibly lead to a downfall,
Yeah.
instead of us succeeding in our ministry. So you are now an associate pastor. You've been a worship pastor for years in other roles, but mainly worship. And now you're steadily in an associate pastor role at your church with discipleship.
Yeah.
Now, with your perspective, what would you say to worship leaders would be what is success as a worship leader?
Well, man, I think success as a worship leader is measured in the same way that success for any other follower of Christ is, and that is faithfulness, right? If you are faithfully pursuing relationship with Jesus and you're being faithful to do the things that he's called you to do, that's success, right? It's not measured uh in numbers, it's not measured in, and here's the thing, like if we're being faithful to what God's called us to do, then some of those other metrics will come along with that. I truly believe that. But those can't be the things that we are aiming at. We have to be aiming at faithfulness. I often think about Jeremiah, at the beginning of his ministry. I mean, God essentially told him, "Hey, I want you to go and preach to these people. By the way, no one's going to listen." Right? Jeremiah never had a single convert in his ministry, but he was successful because he was faithful.
Hmm.
Right? He was obedient to what God had called him to do. And so I think that has to be our measure of success. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't look at other things and have other goals that we want, to accomplish alongside that, but it can't ever be at the expense of that. right? Faithfulness has to be our number one priority. Now, now part of being faithful, right, would be developing your team, helping them to grow as musicians, investing in them as followers of Christ, helping them to grow in their faith, ensuring that they're being formed into the image of Christ, that they're being discipled, knowing your people, knowing the people that you're serving, the people in your church. Don't just be a guy or a girl on the platform. Don't be just a leader on the platform. Be someone who's in the lobby, who knows the people, who are invested in them and involved in a small group, and know what's going on in their lives, that you're praying with them, that you're, all of those aspects of that, because that's the thing that, God cares about the people. He's not really all that concerned with how great our band is. In fact, I would say, and I think I heard Tim Keller say this, he said, Uncle Jimmy's nephew who's visiting from out of town and plays an out of tune saxophone solo for the offertory. If he does that with a heart to make a joyful noise to the Lord is just as pleased with that offering as he is with the most polished production that we might have. Right. So it's our heart that God is after. And so that doesn't mean that we don't pursue excellence. Right? We should do that because we want to give our very best to the Lord. But the priorities have to be in the right order, and faithfulness has to be first.
What has been key to longevity in ministry for you? Because you've been in ministry for a while. So what would you say to those who are listening right now, and give them some advice on really having longevity when it comes to ministry?
The first thing I'll say is, honestly, I've been fortunate to work with some really great pastors over the years. And that's, that's been such a blessing. Beyond that, I'd say a couple of things. Ministry is hard, right? If you love people, if you care about people, you're going to have your heart broken from time to time. There are going to be seasons where you feel out of sync with your lead pastor if you're a worship pastor, or and there's some hard work sometimes that has to be done to get back on the same page. Or sometimes, unfortunately, there may be a time where you feel like, okay, we're going to have to part ways, like I'm going to have to move somewhere else or whatever. But the thing that we have to remember is the same thing that I would tell someone in my congregation or on my team who's sitting down with me that's going through a difficult time, are the truths of God's word, right? That these light afflictions work for us a weight of eternal glory. And so there's something of eternal value that I'm working toward. And so that makes enduring the difficult seasons worth it. Like I try to keep the end in mind rather than looking at the temporary difficulties that may be going on, the frustrations that I may be having. And I think part of it too is, man, look, I would just say, know that you are called to this, right? The worst thing you can do is become a worship leader because you like being a musician. There are plenty of other ways to make music that will involve a lot less heartache, to be honest with you, than being a worship pastor or a worship leader, right? You have to know that you're called to this. I mentioned earlier, I never set out to be a worship leader. I set out to be a pastor. Leading worship was a means to that. I knew that my calling was to serve the church. And so, you have to know that that's your calling. And if you know that that's your calling, then that means that it's worth whatever hardship might come, because God's in it.
Well said. Longevity in ministry is a beautiful thing if God has blessed you with that. And it does take enduring some seasons. One of the things that God has taught me recently is that the storms and seasons of life, they don't last forever.
Right.
They do come and go. And so you have to understand that. You have to sit in that and know that God is with you and that it's going to be okay.
Oddly enough, I saw a video with Denzel Washington recently, and someone asked him, "What do you wish that you had known as a young man?" And he said that this too shall pass.
Right.
And he said, that's true of all of it. The success, this too shall pass. The failures, this too shall pass. That none of it is permanent, that everything is temporary, and that we have to be grounded in something beyond this moment.
Yeah. Worship leading and being in ministry is an amazing experience as God leads you and calls you to it, and you're obedient to that. It's awesome. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be bumps in the road or tragedy or trauma or hard
Right.
things. That's just life.
Yeah.
But if you are where God has called you to be, he is with you as well. And as we're obedient to him, yeah, we won't regret it. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
You know, when I think about people that are coming on this podcast, I think of more than a worship leader idea, you know, and that's what you have shown through your ministry, continue to show. So thank you for your faithfulness, as you mentioned. Thanks for your faithfulness in ministry. And also thanks again for reading the book and for your connection. I love it. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Gary. It's been a privilege, man.
All right. Thanks, Todd.
All right. We'll see you.
Todd is someone who exemplifies being more than a worship leader very well. Behind his various roles and titles in ministry, there was a pastor's heart, a heart to love God and people. He mentioned the danger of us worship leaders wanting the spotlight and notoriety. That's a very real danger and something I talked about in my book. Here's what I said. When we fall in love with being in the spotlight, we can easily forget the reason we are there, to love God and to love people. Every time I go on stage, I pray and ask God to help me love his people as I lead them in songs of praise. I pray that the church quickly sees God and feels his presence and power. I know the stage and spotlights have a purpose, but my goal is to use them to help people see God more than they see me. Being more than a worship leader is not about being better or having a better title. It's about being more than the status quo or stereotypes. It's about having a pastor's heart, even if we don't have the pastor's title. God isn't calling us to have a title, but he is calling us to have a heart to love as he loves. So let us lead with that kind of love and heart. Stay tuned for the next episode of the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'd greatly appreciate you subscribing and sharing. Thanks for listening.